just critiques. And I never did drugs, so I have no clue what this is all about.
I could eat 1,000 chocolate chip cookies.
They didn't have chocolate, as far as I know.
I'm okay. I feel better. What's the big of the bathroom? Lay down. Come to me. Yes, that's it.
I love the birds.
What did he say? He said, "Come, Mr. Taliban. Tell me the matter. Daylight come, and me wanna go home."
1980s.
Oh, earlier than that, I think.
70s.
Yeah. Yeah, Steve Martin is older now. This is the oldest I've ever been. But you know, that's sorry for ruining your mind. That, you know how mind works. You're never going to forget that now. Sorry about that. By the way, when I say I'm sorry about that, I'm not really. I'm just trying to protect myself from lawsuits and things. So, where was I? Oh, so the Crito has come and says, you know, we've bribed everybody. You can go with us, and we're going to take you out of town. It's really interpreted that way, and Socrates says no. When Athens, which is like my mother, decides that this is what I ought to do, even if I feel like they're wrong, I ought to do what my city says I should do. So if you think about it, boy, that's you know an argument that applies to like our government, you know. So you know we vote for things, you know, and you know maybe the person that you voted for gets elected, maybe not. Maybe the you know the things you want to happen or not, right? Mostly not, right? Francis Fukuyama, in his one book on democracy, argues that that's the beauty of a democracy, that things are so complex that nobody can ever get anything done. You know, and that protects everybody from having someone else do something you don't like. It's one of the wonderful things about democracy. So if you feel like nothing ever, you know, gets done right, well, that's actually everyone's protected from someone else getting their way, you know, in a way. But the thing that Socrates is going to argue is that even if the opponent wins, your obligation is to still support that person because that's your government, right? At least, you know, within the context of following the law and so on, right? You might still want to be critical of that person and write, terrible things about them, maybe, whatever. But at the same time, theoretically, you don't have the right to disobey the law if that's what happens, right? So, Crito, kind of an interesting dialogue, relatively short. And then the Phaedo is the natural one that follows up on that. And by the way, if we look, actually go visit as a tourist and see the place where Socrates was in prison and drank the hemlock, etc. It's still there. So that's cool, I suppose. But in the Phaedo, what's the really important thing in the Phaedo? The nature of the soul. So this is where Plato gives us the reason why individuals are remembering stuff when they're learning something new. And that's where we get the words amnesia, a forgetting, and anamnesis, which means remembering, right? Both Greek words that are associated with this theory. But why is the soul important here? Socrates is not really too concerned about what death means for him, because it's like that next, stage on life's way. He doesn't know what's coming, but 50-50 could be that my soul continues on, and as far as they're concerned, the soul has no parts. Because what they mean by the soul is that internal self that they're thinking is me, right? Not the body. And that's a Platonic concept also, right? That the important part of me is this soul that in some sense is trapped in the body. In fact, the expression that the body is the prison house of the soul. Because from your birth, the soul is like slapped into this body, and now you're stuck in this body until the body dies, and then the soul is released and probably goes into another body somewhere. Right? Where does that come from? Chances are it's a Hindu belief, and if you look at the proximity of Asia and so on, a lot of those beliefs certainly were part of what the Greeks believed as well. And so the idea of reincarnation, right? If you're from the South, it's reincarnation. But if you're thinking reincarnation means back to the meat, chili con carne, with meat, right? So your soul goes back to the meat, goes into another body. Some of these could be funny, I guess it's early in the morning. Wait till it snows, see how early it feels. But in any case, the soul has no parts. And if you think about it, for something to be created, put the parts together. And now you have it. To destroy something, pull it apart. Now it's destroyed, right? But the soul has no parts. And so therefore it can't be made, nor can it be destroyed. It's eternal, right? I mean, it's not just Plato. I'm pretty sure that the Zoroastrian religion might have believed this, and I know, the Pharaoh's got a task, that he's got to make sure his heart is lighter than a feather so that he can go on into what would be the equivalent of heaven, for the pharaohs, all that stuff. So there's this view that the important part of us is not a physical being, but a soul that has no parts and is therefore eternal. Can't be made, can't be destroyed. By the way, when you get to the Roman Catholic, or rather, the Christian point of view, you end up with the idea that the soul is created when motion begins in the womb, right? That's, when it becomes animated, but that's going to come later, right? We'll see how that works, right? Yes? Right? That's just another interesting aspect of how all this interrelates with one another. But so the soul can't be killed, and so as far as Socrates is concerned, he's going to have his soul still. And will he then go to the right or go to the left? He'll have a choice maybe, and will he be able to spend all eternity until his next reincarnation, I suppose, conversing with other people who are all interesting. So basically he'll continue doing what he does. in the future from his point of view, as far as he knows. So the Phaedo is pretty interesting. But the Meno, which was, how many folks had fun reading the Meno? And the question is, can virtue be taught? Virtue be taught? And Socrates argues that there are lots of individuals that are very virtuous as far as their town, Athens, is concerned, or other towns as well. Anytus, by the way, seems to be from somewhere else. And notice Anytus was one of the ones who prosecuted him in the Apology. So when we're looking at the Meno, theoretically we're going back in time before the Apology, of course, and before the Phaedo, of course, because Socrates is there, very much alive, not in trouble, right? When was the Meno written? There's argument that the Meno is a middle dialogue. So by this point, Plato is really telling us what he thinks and not Socrates. And notice in the dialogue, it's one of those, like Steve Martin points out, you always just sat there. Socrates, what is virtue? What, etc. And I was the one that had to, So at this point, it's like Plato is just using the concept of a dialogue in order to teach what he thinks is the answer. And so you've got Socrates giving answers instead of being an asshole as he was in the first set of dialogues, right? Because he asks the questions and it never comes up with an answer. Now we get to the point where you've got answers. And it's really boring because, yes, Socrates. Wow, that's beautiful, Socrates. Oh, it's brilliant, Socrates. And there's no real give and take as you would have had in the earlier dialogues. But, and by the way, some argue that the Meno is actually an in-between dialogue, so one of the earlier of the middle dialogues. Just fun. But in any case, can virtue be taught? And this really gets into Plato's elitist theory. Remember I said that Plato's real name was Aristocles, the glory of the best. And he's essentially going to argue through his philosophy that some individuals have more soul than others. This doesn't really seem to make sense to us, but when you look around, you notice that some people seem more virtuous than others. And in the Meno, he points out that you've got virtuous people, and then they have sons who are really important because they're the sons of really important people, even Pericles' son, for example, and yet at the same time, these kids all seem to be assholes. Which, that's why Anytus is pissed off at him, by the way, because you shouldn't be saying that about important people, and so he scoots off. That's it. He's pissed off, and boy, when he gets the chance, he's going to get even, right? But so Socrates is going to argue that virtue really can't be taught, because if it could be taught, these virtuous people would for sure make sure that their sons, I didn't even mention their daughters, their sons would be virtuous as well. It can teach them all kinds of things. That's why it gets into a matter of knowledge versus virtue, because it seems like virtue can't be taught. Now, some people will argue that the dialogue does seem to indicate that virtue can be taught, but the problem is they don't know how it's taught. But on the other hand, it seems like people are born to be a certain type of character. And that's why there seems to be people with better souls than others. And how do you account for that? It seems like there's some individuals that have more soul. Maybe it has to do with how much soul got into the body at birth. None of this really makes sense, and especially in terms of modern psychology, it's all ridiculous. But what happens, of course, here is that this is conceiving of a system whereby you have individuals that are going to be the best. Sorry, I'm using old technology. Have it. Should do something. How do you spell psychology? For some reason I have trouble finding these. Oh, I'm in ChatGPT. No, that's Quora. How did that happen? Let me just. Oh, okay. I'll just stick with this here. That's not going to get any bigger. Maybe if I go there. No, I'm still stuck there. That's not forever. Okay. Well, I'll just use this. This is about as big as this anyway. So notice there's the triangle design, and the idea is we've got workers down here